This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, presenting Military History Night for April the 29th, 2013. Tonight we feature Professor Sunil Ram speaking on the Battle of Kadesh, fought in 1274 BC between the Pharaoh of Egypt, Ramesses II, and the Kingdom of the Hittites.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for coming. It's been a while since I've been out. I'm going to ask everybody to bear with me a little. I've been quite ill for some time now, so I'm a little wobbly on my feet. So if I suddenly stop in mid-sentence, it's because I'm just trying to let the vertigo settle. Has everybody got a timeline sheet that was up at the front? It's really going to help you a lot. You'll notice that I have some orange insets in the timeline. Those are because the chronology of this period has been either disputed, or there are historians and archaeologists who have agendas, so they want to fit things into certain time frames. So the dates I'm using are the generally accepted ones. And you'll understand why we've got such a wide topic. Why is Kadesh historically relevant is really the question. And the reason is that from a military history perspective, it is one of the first battles from the ancient world where we have a complete record of the event, which we can identify as an absolute historical battle in the Middle East. Another example would be something like the Battle of Kurukshetra, which is represented in the Bhagavad Gita of the ancient Vedic world. So, Kadesh. We have to put Kadesh in context. So we have to actually start some years before, about 300 years before. And let's get the computer to work. We have to look at Theorem, the ancient Minoan island. And Thera today is known as Santorini. It still exists. There was a great explosion in Thera. I'm not going to go through the dates, etc. You can see them up there. What it created was a complete and utter disruption of the Mediterranean world. And more specifically, the Eastern Mediterranean was essentially destroyed as a civilization. And that civilization was the Minoan culture. And that was centered on Crete. Thera was one of its northern outposts. What it did was it disrupted trade, it disrupted the environment, and it created a mass exodus of people who we will encounter many times during this historical wonder. Now, Thera, this is my argument, you can choose to disagree, is in fact the historical Atlantis. Plato, of course, is the source that we use for Atlantis. And everybody knows the story of how Plato goes, Atlantis is west of the Pillars of Hercules. This is the primary measure everybody uses. And of course, everyone knows the Pillars of Hercules today are in fact the Straits of Gibraltar. So if it's west, it should be in the Atlantic. But that's the first major error amateurs make about archaeology in this region. The ancient Pillars of Hercules, which were well known at the time, fall somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. They could be as far out as Malta. Other examples are actually the Straits and the Bosphorus leading to the Black Sea, which is in fact the route that Jason and the Argonauts took. So what we have is a modern misrepresentation. Now, if we look at the Minoan culture and we look at the archaeology that we do have, this is a highly advanced culture. Its art was advanced, its technology was advanced. It was the dominant power in the central and eastern Mediterranean at the time. The explosion of Thera was so massive that the island itself, that's a modern image of it. That's what was left. But interestingly, you'll notice the rising of the caldera in the center of that image. And one of the descriptions that is given by Plato is, of course, that this was an island of circular harbors. And in fact, when we look at the physical remains of Thera today and we look at the structure of the island in theory, we can sort of project backwards what the island looked like. It fits the Homeric myth, the Platonic myth. And therefore, Plato is recording a real event in a real location that we can actually identify. And between historians and archaeologists, we generally see Thera as the model of Atlantis. And what Atlantis was the larger Minoan culture based in Crete. King Minos, all those stories. So, here we have the destruction of a major culture which creates a ripple effect throughout the region. We'll come back to this. The Bible. Of course, Pharaoh is not named in the Bible. But, of course, we all think it's Yul Brynner. At least most people do. And the majority of the modern mythology of the Exodus is predicated on the Charlton Heston movie. Most of it is, in fact, empirically wrong. It's a Hollywood construct, which has become part of the modern history of the region. But it doesn't help when we have people like James Cameron and his group of experts in this particular documentary saying that somehow the Exodus is directly linked with the events of Thera, the explosion, and leading up into the period of where the Battle of Kadesh falls. It's a massive compression of history which, frankly, isn't sort of held up when we start looking at the archaeology. So the question then becomes, who is Pharaoh? I mean, who was the Pharaoh of the Bible? Because if we can pinpoint the Pharaoh of the Bible, we can then theoretically pinpoint Exodus and all the other linkages. And I have to stress the Bible is a book of faith. More so, the Old Testament is a book of faith that was written by the Jewish people from their perspective. We always must keep that in mind. Therefore, whoever writes the history tends to overlay their perspective on the history. Everyone thinks it's Ramesses. Why is this important? Because, of course, Ramesses was the pharaoh who fought at Kadesh. So if the Exodus and Thera all fall in this time frame, we're dealing with one of the most important pharaohs of the Egyptian world, and the most important pharaoh of the New Kingdom. However, there are some fundamental problems with the use of Ramesses. First and foremost, he died at age 90, which isn't really made clear in the Bible, but there isn't really any evidence that there was a great catastrophe during his reign. In fact, it is Ramesses who raises Egypt to one of its greatest times. The other aspect of the Bible story, of course, is, the first son died under the plagues. The problem is that Ramses' first son died at approximately age 25. Now, the historical myth is that, of course, he was a young child. But, of course, the Bible doesn't specify. It only says the firstborn died. Evidence shows that, and this is physical evidence of what we think is the mummy of his first son, is that he died from actually a physical blow, not a disease. So, again, the forensics and the archaeology tend to discount Ramesses as the pharaoh of the Bible, which then, of course, begs the question, who is it? And there's a lot of candidates. So we're just going to ignore him. And we're going to move on to Thutmose III, who was around somewhat before Ramesses. Now, why do we think, and this is purely my analysis, so you can contradict me all you want on this one, but why do we think it's Thutmose? There's several reasons. He, like Ramesses, was a great builder, but he rebuilt the Egyptian world far more than Ramesses did. Also, his firstborn did die young, interestingly. We have an account of that. What's also interesting is that at the tail end of his reign, he was actually a co-pharaoh, and this happened a lot during the pharaonic period. You get two pharaohs at the same time, a father who was either too sick or a son who was sort of taking over. And his son was reasonably young, and his son, so Thutmose' grandson, did die young. So we have some of the key elements of the biblical story that tie quite well with the story of Thutmose. Now, what we also have is some of, and this is just one of my personal little things, we're not going to go into the detail of the Exodus, but let me correct a major historical error. It wasn't the Red Sea that was parted. That is a mistranslation. It was the Reed Sea. And the Reed Sea you could walk over. So potentially, and this is why they make the argument of Theorem being part of this, is that had there been some sort of major tectonic event in the central eastern Mediterranean like Theorem, there would have been a tsunami effect which would have drawn the waters away out of the Reed Sea and the sea parts. I can't argue for it or against it, but it's a reasonable geological argument, and also enough water goes away from those marshes, yeah, it's pretty easy to transverse. So there's some of the issues that we have trying to bring Ramesses into this picture, because the Ramessian history does not fit any of these other periods that they're linked with. So my vote. Now, enter the Sea Peoples, a very important group. If Theorem, which would be approximately here, explodes, all those people who were left over from the Minoan culture had to go somewhere. And we have records of multiple invasions over several hundred years of a generic group of people called the Sea Peoples, made up of multiple different groups, most of whom we think we've identified. I'm not going to go through the whole list for sake of brevity, but you can hopefully see, assuming you can read tiny, tiny writing there, there's some lists. And again, we see the Sea Peoples enter into the Battle of Kadesh. In fact, as we will encounter them, they are in fact fighting on the side of Ramesses. So we see a linkage in history over time where the Sea Peoples come and disrupt what is left of the Mediterranean. It creates a social upheaval through the great empires of the region. So it is something to consider in our ongoing story. These are the several invasions that we have recorded, and the Amana Letters are where some of them are recorded. This is our Ramesses part, just before Kadesh. And the Shardana, or Sharda, there's different names used for them, we think are probably Sardinians, people from Sardinia. And don't forget the Sea People in our little romp through history, because they're going to come back at the very end of this story. This is what we think they look like. That's a depiction based on the various carvings and reliefs that we have in Egypt. And they were considered a very warlike people, and one of the interesting parts is they had technology. They had iron weapons, apparently. And again, this sort of ties a little into the whole story of Atlantis, because of course most civilizations of this time had copper weapons. You have an iron weapon versus a copper weapon, you have a massive technological advantage. It's relevant to know the empires of this period, because Kadesh falls within what would be considered sort of almost some have argued they've called it a world war even. And the key empires are the Hittites, Mizri, which is Egypt, and the Mycenaeans, or an area called Achaeola, the Achaeans. And I'm being a little liberal here with the transliterations. There's lots of variations here, so we can all argue the technical points, but this is where I'm going with. Now, one of the really interesting parts of Egypt, where did the word Egypt came from? It was actually a Greek name given, because the Egyptians, and I'm gonna butcher this, actually called Egypt Hot Ak-Ta, the house of the Ka of Ta. They couldn't pronounce it, so they called it Egypt. So one of those funny little historical anomalies that has continued on for thousands of years. In this context, of course, the two great warring nations are the Hittites and the Egyptian Empire. There were two phases. There was the old kingdom of the Hittites, which is the red area, and the new kingdom of the Hittites here, which is the orange area. See this little place up here, Wilusa? That's Troy. That's the Hittite name for Troy. It comes into this story too. This map can vary. I'm going to accept this as the extent of the Hittite kingdom. But some maps show it to be somewhat vaster or greater, extending all the way out to Wilusa. The key thing about the Hittites is that Kadesh sits right on the border of the Egyptian Empire and the Empire of Hatti. This is what Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire, would have looked like. This is actual reconstruction on site. This is what it looks like in terms of the ruins. The Egyptian Empire. I thought it was worthwhile people know what the pyramids would have looked like as opposed to what we always see. I think we also get this impression of the ancient world as a place of gray and brown stones with no color. Everything was painted. And this was a very colorful world, because color was expensive. And if you could paint things, that showed you had wealth and power. Now, the Egyptian empire, as you can see, and again, we notice Thutmose here, the Egyptian empire was much larger. Ramesses was actually the pharaoh who rebuilt the empire in the New Kingdom after the Hyksos had conquered the old Egyptian world, and then eventually the Egyptians took it back, and Ramesses expands that period, and therefore this is why Kadesh becomes very important in that expansion process. And that's an image at the bottom of the remains of the capital of the Hittite Empire.
First and foremost.
The key aspect is what we know of the Hittite military is actually from the Egyptians. So we have to be a little circumspect on how the Egyptians portrayed them. But we do know that they were an absolute warrior nation that swept out of Anatolia and openly challenged Egypt. The chariots were what mattered. It was the Hyksos who had introduced the chariots to the Mediterranean region and the Near East. And they became, under the Hittites, literally armored tanks. The horses were armored, the soldiers were armored, and in effect, the Hittites used them as their primary force. The Hittites would charge into battle, clobber you with their chariots, and then the infantry would follow in afterwards and pick off whoever was left. And one has to imagine not a few hundred chariots, but thousands of chariots massed coming straight at you. So if anyone's ever seen an armored charge with tanks, or actually seen a full-blown cavalry charge, just the sheer thunder of the hooves is enough to shake soldiers in their boots because it's terrifying. The Hittite commander at the Battle of Kadesh. And I'm going to butcher the name, King Mutawali, or Muatalai, depending on which one you want to use as a pronunciation. He'd been king for some time. We think he was in his late 40s or early 50s. He'd reigned for about 20 years. He was an experienced leader. And it's very important to make that point, because to be king of the Hittites meant you had to kill all your rivals. This is one of the problems with the Hittite Empire, was that the changing of the guard, so to speak, amongst the ruling elite was through the death of all your opponents, or getting everybody else to agree with you. Otherwise, you'd kill them. He was considered bold, and he was also dealing with a large strategic problem. He had the Egyptians to the south, and he now had the Mycenaeans, which are our Achaeans, the Kiowa, of which Troy was part of that world. So we see the Greeks of Mycenae, or the Mycenaeans, the Spartans, the Mycenaeans, the Ionians, etc., were slowly expanding into Hittite territory. He could not fight a two-front war. So he needed to do something about the Egyptians, because it was easier to deal with them than a bunch of rabble-rouser barbarians who were the Greeks, who we consider civilized. The two images at the bottom are pretty much the only images that we have of this particular king. So it's interesting that we have these, but this is all lost history until we discovered the Hittites were a real people. The Hittite forces at Kadesh, based on the Egyptians, we think there's 50,000 of them. They were composed of the Hittite regulars and their 18 vassal states, which included Anatolian Greeks, interestingly. 37,000 infantry. Canada can't field more than, what, 3,000 on a good day? So this is a major army by even modern standards. Their army included archers built in, so they had ready long-range and medium-range fire, if we want to put that in military context. And of course, what mattered, the chariots. The chariots were a separate force that operated independently of the infantry. And there were two types, heavy chariots and light chariots. And we'll go into the details of these in a second. The heavy chariot, the tank. A three-man chariot. The critical aspect of this chariot was that wheel. By moving the wheel from the rear of the chariot and centering it, allowed for greater stability, which allowed for a three-man force, which upped your firepower essentially by 100%, which is a huge, huge change in a battlefield. Also, they armored their chariots. Now, something that's not depicted here is a lot of times off the spokes they also had blades or spikes. So they didn't actually have to hit you, they could just drive by and clip your legs. That's a very terrifying effect for unarmored infantry especially. Your reaction as infantry is you're going to step out of the way. thus breaking your formation, thus the heavy chariots break your line very rapidly. The way they fought was as they went by, they'd chuck a spear at you, or they just jab you. So as you're wheeling as an infantryman, suddenly you get the spear plowed into you, but it's not one chariot, it's 5 or 6 chariots hitting your front line at the same time. That was an immense amount of firepower that they could put onto you. And at speed, because let's also include inertia. If I'm moving forward and I throw a spear at you, I also have the added inertia of the chariot put into that spear. That's going to go right through your armor. They also had light chariots. These are the traditional chariots of the era. And these were used more as archery platforms and as a secondary skirmish line. So this is where they get the added firepower in the battle. The infantry. The infantry were pretty basic, but they did have light armor. And one of the interesting things is the Egyptians insulted them. They called them Humpty, which means essentially women soldiers because their hair was long. And there are accounts that apparently in the battle when the Egyptians, and I can't verify this because I can't find the actual hieroglyph that it apparently is on, they actually pulled Hittite soldiers from their chariots, the Egyptian infantry, by their hair because it was easy to grab. It was one bit that they could get at. An interesting observation of the battle. The one thing that the Hittites had, they had iron weapons. This gave them a massive technological, tactical, and strategic advantage over any of their foes. And we think that they got those iron weapons from our old friends, the Sea Peoples, Atlantis. In effect, just to put that in context, iron is harder than copper, so if you use a copper weapon against an iron weapon, your weapon is going to break down and possibly snap. So this is the big technological advantage. And these are a couple of samples of Hittite weapons. I was hoping to actually have some real stuff here today, but the logistics of getting it out of a couple of museums didn't quite work. Well, I didn't have the time, would be more appropriate, to do the paperwork. The Egyptian commander is, of course, Ramesses the Great, ostensibly not the Pharaoh of the Bible. He's very different. He's only 25 years old. He's only been in power for 5 years. It is very clear that the Hittites chose to attack when they did because they were testing to see if they could challenge the new Egyptian Pharaoh. Now, he is a war leader. There's no question about that, because almost immediately he heads into, it's actually in the region of Libya, and also in the region of the Nile Delta specifically, not Libya, but he did go there, where he fought the Shardan, the Sardinians, who were a Sea Peoples group. So again, these Sea Peoples keep popping into our story. They're always sort of ever present in what is going on in the Near East. So he's a proven war leader. That's a very important point, but he's young and relatively inexperienced. And in all battle analysis, you always have to look at the capabilities of the leaders, the key leaders who are making the decisions, because it affects how the battle may play out. The Egyptian army had changed from the Old Kingdom, and we're going to have to go through this step by step. In the Old Kingdom, it was a levy army. By the New Kingdom, Ramesses and his predecessors have changed the Egyptian army into a professional force. The chariots are state-owned, but ridden by a noble class. They're an elite. big difference about Egyptian chariots is they're generally faster and more agile than their equivalent Anatolian models. And that's because the Egyptians had shifted the axle slightly. We know this, and we'll find out why in a few minutes. Again, the Egyptians changed their formations into a professional class of soldier made up primarily of Nubians. The Nubians were the professional class in the Old Kingdom, but they were a very small corps. Now they fill out the ranks. But also, there aren't enough soldiers, as we all discover in modern times, so there's a lot of mercenary elements within the Egyptian army. The chariots are used in a totally different way by the Egyptians. They're used as long-range artillery harassment. So they ride the chariots in, pelt you with arrows, and ride away before you can do anything. They might take a few of you, and then they come around and they do it again. And they use it as a form of skirmish line. Depicted in the films, you tend to see these massive chariots charging at each other. That's not what the Egyptians seem to have done. The infantry troops were organized into corps divisions, but unlike the combined arms idea, where you have, in modern times, heavy machine guns, light machine guns, a mortar team, and you clump them all together, the Egyptians separated them. You had solely spear brigades, archery brigades, axe brigades, slinger brigades, although they weren't using slings by this period. The interesting part is the best soldiers, the newest, the soldiers the most experienced were always put in the front ranks. The less experienced to the back would be the newest recruits. That way, an Egyptian line would not break, because the best troops are the ones who are fighting at the front, and the ones in the rear would tend to hold their ground. It was a very interesting psychological adaptation for close quarter combat, because of course all combat in this period is close quarter. And there were numerous technological changes to Egyptian weapons, and we'll detail those in a second. The Egyptian army at Kadesh. 20,000 men, so about considerably less, but still more than the Canadian army can field today on a good day. There were Nubians, of course, as the regulars. There were Canaanite auxiliaries. Now, this is a little subject to interpretation. Some historians say this was an elite force. I frankly don't see any evidence of this. There is much more evidence to show that there was some sort of levies that were raised as Ramesses moved northwards up to Kadesh. And of course, those damn sea people again. There they are, they're now no longer fighting. They're as part of Ramses' army. Not only that, they've become an elite force, which again ties into sort of the oldest story of Atlantis, superior troops, superior society. Again, somewhat a little conjecture here, but they end up as part of his royal guard. His infantry. 4 divisions named after gods. These included archers, but here's the big difference. The chariots were spread out within the 4 divisions, 500 chariots each. These were all light chariots. And this is what they looked like. The Egyptians had some limited armor, but remember, they're fighting in a very hot environment. So Egyptian troops preferred not to have armor because it was too heavy and it was cumbersome in the heat. They couldn't operate well. So this is a different technological issue than the Hittites, who came from much colder climate in central Anatolia, and they wore armor. Interesting point here, the hand. The body count for the Pharaoh was done by cutting off the hand of the enemy. Some say the left, others say the right, but it was one or the other. And you would literally, as a soldier on the battlefield, hack the hand off, collect it in a bag, come in front of the Pharaoh as generals, your officers, and dump your bag and count the hands. That's how they got the body count. And again, the infantry carried bows, but not compound bows. The compound bow is a very expensive weapon, very hard to make, and that was carried by the chariot. So that's somewhat of a difference. They had a special weapon, the Kadesh. And the oddest weapon of all, the Egyptian throwing stick, which was actually a quite ancient weapon. Most of you know a throwing stick as a boomerang. These ones don't come back. The Egyptians still carried them. They're actually a relatively ineffective weapon. Traditionally, they were actually used as a hunting weapon. However, imagine 300-400 soldiers lined up in front of you. As you close at them, and they pull out these heavy sticks and they chuck them at you. Now, they're not going to really hurt you, but they are a very good distraction right at the moment before you come into contact. So as the enemy closes just before striking distance, suddenly a stick is chucked in your face. What do? You're instinctively going to deflect it with your shield, or you're going to duck, or you're going to dodge, or you're going to take a stick in the face. So it was still a somewhat effective weapon when used en masse. But an interesting archaic weapon that, frankly, at this period in history was really relatively ineffective, because we're dealing with the Hittites who are charging you with chariots, not infantry. So all of a sudden, what are you going to do with your stick? So an interesting little anomaly in the historical weapons arms race. Here we have our Sharda. This is what we think they looked like. And they made up part of the mercenary force / royal guard at Kadesh. If you have time, I really recommend you actually watch Building Pharaoh's Chariot, because it will give you some great insights into how advanced the Egyptian chariot was.
In ancient Egypt, a pharaoh's secret weapon, the chariot represents a huge turning point in military history.
Apparently it doesn't want to turn off, so we'll have to let it play out. The Hyksos were the ones who introduced the chariots. The Egyptian chariots were 2 men, a driver and an archer who also carried spears. So it was a ranged weapon as well as a potential short-range weapon. But again, remember, it was used as a skirmish line, not as a direct charge. If they charged at you, they'd shoot at you, then wheel away. And, of course, the chariots were actually used, unlike the Hittite chariots, as a mechanism to allow the infantry to engage. So they were really a support weapon for the infantry, even though they were an elite. So where's Kadesh, after all this talk of weapons and stuff? The map says it all. The Orontes River. The smaller map is sort of Kadesh in context of the time frame we're dealing with and the cities that would have been in that area. This is the modern Kadesh, Tel Nebi Mend. That's an actual satellite image. That's what it looks like. And this was an archaeological dig, and I give you sort of a basic map of what this is. Before the battle, Ramesses moves from Pi Ramesses, which is actually a very important city. It used to be the capital of the Hyksos, Avaris, and it is systematically dismantled, and the Egyptians rebuild their capital there as a message to say, we've destroyed the Hyksos. Mid-April, he starts moving forward up the coast towards Kadesh. It takes approximately a month's march. The Egyptian army doesn't move as an army, it moves in its 4 separate divisions. Remember those names of the 4 gods? That's how they move up the coast. There's a reason for that, by the way. There's not a lot of food out there. So each division scavenges separately rather than a mass that would actually eat up everything in sight like locusts, which would then potentially disrupt the local region's economy. So this was a consideration. Also, the Egyptians didn't fight with such big armies. Usually it was 1 division. To put 4 together was a major, major event for the Egyptian military. Late May, Ramesses reaches Kadesh. He's about 1 day's march with the Amun division. The Nerin force has gone along the coast, and this is why I'm going to argue that this were actually levies that were taken along rather than a sort of an elite force. They have moved somewhat north of Kadesh, and they will return to the battle soon. Ramesses' first tactical maneuver, an error, is as the 4 divisions move in their formation up the coast towards Kadesh, they get to the river and they capture some Bedouin. Now, it seems that these Bedouin were actually sent there by the Hittites as a decoy, because they give a story that the Hittites aren't at Kadesh. So a bit of counterintelligence before the battle. And it also shows the youth of Ramesses, because he accepts the story without doing any reconnaissance. So, believing the story, he says, okay, Kadesh is mine. I'm going to set up camp, let my army rest, wait for the rest of my divisions to catch up, who are some hours, if not upwards of half a day behind. The next morning, they actually capture some Hittite scouts, only to discover the Hittites aren't miles and miles away. They're hiding on the other side of the Tell of Kadesh, as you could see the rise in the picture I'd shown earlier. So all of a sudden, Ramesses has 1 division against the whole of the Hittite army. He's outnumbered approximately 30,000 to 5,000 at this point. We move into the battle, and I'm breaking it down into sort of 3 phases. Bear with the map. The location of the Hittite camp is actually inaccurate. I didn't get a chance to change it. The camp is probably closer to here, as best as I can figure. And the Egyptian camp would probably be a little bit down here. But that's speculation. That's all it is. We could put these things pretty much anywhere in terms of the general locations. Ramesses, of course, hearing that the Hittites are there, sends a message back to the Ra division and Ta that, hey, you better hurry up and come and find us. That's his second tactical error, because he hasn't done any reconnaissance. All he's heard is that the Hittites are over here, but he doesn't actually know where the Hittites are. He hasn't seen them. As the Ra division moves forward to meet up with Amun, the Hittites do a classic Hittite full chariot charge, flanking the division, which is not formed up to fight, but is in column of route. That's in marching along happily, at speed, because they're trying to catch up. Ra is obviously instantly overrun. There's no way the Egyptians can stand against a full Hittite charge without being set to take the charge. If everyone knows what a British square is, if you don't set your square, you're going to get overrun by the fuzzy wuzzies. Ra collapses. The Hittites then wheel north and they attack Ramesses' encampment. Ramesses is still in his camp with his troops, wondering what's going on. This is his own account, by the way. We move into the second phase of the battle for the camp. The elements of Ra, mainly the infantry, mainly the chariots, my fault, they get to the Hittite camp because they're faster than the balance of the Ra division, which is infantry, which is just being slaughtered by the Hittite charge. The Hittites overrun the Egyptian camp. Ramesses, from his chariot, he's put on his armor. We actually have this account of how he puts on his armor. He begins to fight back with the infantry of Amun because they're able to form up. They're able to somehow, according to Ramesses, they disrupt the Hittite chariots by holding them and also by laying on accurate archery fire. This is a bit of a tale on the part of Ramesses in the wonderful victory at Kadesh that he writes about. This is getting into the propaganda part of this lecture. What really happens is the Hittites have just charged into a bunch of tents and lines of the enemy. A chariot charge is going to get disrupted because you can't charge a chariot through a tent, obviously, or around fires, or the baggage train, and all the other clutter that sits inside an encampment. But also, it's an Egyptian encampment. It's full of goodies. The Egyptians are filthy rich. They've got lots of gold and clutter and all sorts of stuff. The Hittites, well, they stop and get off their chariots and start collecting their loot. Which, of course, is part of the reason why the Egyptian infantry is able to reform and they start shooting at the chariots, which aren't moving or moving slowly or maneuvering, which makes it pretty easy to target them now. And also, if you've got that long flowing hair, I can come up and pull you off the chariot. Phase 3 of the battle. Ramesses takes advantage of this moment. This is the first solid tactical move that he makes in the battle. He's effectively lost the Battle of Kadesh at this moment. He takes his chariots and he sweeps around and he charges the disrupted Hittite chariot force because it's no longer in a solid formation. And of course, it's what elements have moved out of the camp are now disrupted as well. The result is, at the same time, those Nerin chaps that we're not sure who exactly they are, they show up. So all of a sudden, the Hittite force is now facing a pincer. And Nerin apparently has chariots as well. The Hittites cannot maneuver, given that they are in a pincer. They're also disrupted by the Egyptian infantry, accurate archery fire from the Egyptians, and they're actually getting slaughtered at this point. The result is, of course, they break and attempt to retreat. There are several fords, which are the only places that you can cross the Orontos. They have to get back to those fords. This is actually a little wadi. They could cross that, but there are a couple of fords along here that they needed to get back to. Ramesses, seeing them, makes a snap decision and charges them with his chariots. Something that generally the Egyptians don't do, because that's really the job of the infantry. What he does is he forces them towards the Orontos, which is the way they're going, to those fords. The Hittites commit their chariot reserve. the result is that the chariots have to now cross the ford to get over to the side where the balance of the heavy chariots are, or at least what's left of them. By which point the Egyptians have also come around to that point. Again, the timing of this is a little off. We'd have to play with a war game to figure out the timing. Now, the accounts indicate 6 charges which the Egyptians hold off. But they couldn't have done it if the chariots had crossed the ford. So what we're probably getting a depiction of is the Hittite chariots trying to cross the ford and getting picked off by Egyptian archery fire as they sort of massed across those little areas they can cross. Keeping in mind, the heavy chariots are trying to go the other way at the same time. There's effective chaos at that point. The Hittite chariots cannot cross, and the Hittites are decimated. Now, this is critical to understand because, of course, the Hittite chariots were the primary force of the Hittite Empire. And incredibly, during this whole time, all of the Hittite infantry sit in the Hittite camp and do nothing. What we think is the Hittite generals and the leadership thought they had won the battle and realized too late that they hadn't, by which point it was too late to commit their infantry. In short, Ramesses, through a sheer act of bravery and maybe at the moment tactical awareness, or situational awareness as we say in modern terms, took advantage, and he essentially gained a victory out of what was in fact a defeat up to that point. Because if we think at least one quarter of the Egyptian military had been wiped out in that chariot charge that the Hittites hit them with. So this is the essential elements of the battle. They're all recorded by the Egyptians, which of course leads us to what happened. The post-battle is really important to this. Hittite infantry just simply walks inside the walls of Kadesh. They still outnumber the Egyptian force. What do the Egyptians do? Well, they don't actually have enough forces to take on an entrenched force inside a defendable position, the city of Kadesh. So Ramesses turns around and leaves. And the whole Egyptian army retreats. And in fact, he retreats back into Egypt. What he claims, however, is it was the greatest Egyptian victory of all time. We defeated those evil, batty Hittites, those long-haired women soldiers. We crushed them all. We buried their dead in the river or in the Orontes. And he then promptly depicted it on every single temple he could find, and even on the Ramesses, which is his funerary temple. So when you actually look at many of the images you see of Egypt, it's usually this battle that you're looking when you see the carvings depicted in all these documentaries. There are similar objects. A couple of interesting points about Egyptian pharaohs. Notice how much bigger he is than everybody else, because of course, he's a god. At this point, he's not a god. He's still quite young, but later on he becomes a god while he's still alive. And it is also part of the propaganda of how important this battle was, how important Ramesses is, and how incredible this battle was for Egypt. Which is what we accepted for about 80 years, once we were able to translate the hieroglyphs, because we didn't have the Hittite version of what happened. The Hittites, on the other hand, said, no, we won. And this is a great debate amongst historians now, really, who won the battle. I'm going to toss it to the Hittites, frankly, because The critical element here is that the Egyptian Empire never went any further than Kadesh. Small technical point to that, I will get to it in a minute. But effectively, that is as far north as they really got. Kadesh was the limits. And the Hittites at that point had no reason to go further south because they had other issues along the Syrian frontier and also along their frontier with the Greeks, the Achaeans. We don't have a direct reference to the Battle of Kadesh. What we have are elements referencing it from the remnants of the various diplomatic archives that have been found and translated. But one of the interesting points is the brother of the king at Kadesh complaining to Ramesses, saying, you're not telling the truth. What was all this hoopla about you won? And it's a formal letter. And we have Ramesses' reply saying, what are you talking about? We won. So it's an interesting dialogue that we actually have historically of that period. So what we have is a partial victory for the Hittites and a Pyrrhic victory for the Egyptians, is my analysis of the battle. What happens is, however, is that Ramesses isn't so happy about this. And he ends up attempting to take Kadesh at least 2 more times. He does in fact take it, but he can't hold it. And the Hittites actually retake it. And this is a matter of about a year. So the result is there's a stalemate on that frontier. Let's look at the DMZ between North and South Korea. They're both at war, but no one's going to win. This results in the peace treaty, or the Treaty of Kadesh, as it's referred to sometimes, between the new king of the Hittites, who is the brother of Mutawawi, in which they realize that it's foolish to continue fighting. So this is the first actual complete peace treaty with all the subcomponents, subparagraphs of Addendum C. We have it all. It includes things like, okay, if this is going to happen, you, Ramesses, have to marry a Hittite princess and bring her to Egypt so that, we won't fight each other. So it's a very interesting document. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. It'll bore you to death. If you want a fun diplomatic archive to read, it's fully translated. The result, in terms of the larger historical context, the end of Ramesses' reign, we see a slow decline of Egypt. Egypt goes no further. In terms of the Sea Peoples, they return. As we saw earlier, there's a series of Sea Peoples attacks. So we see this constant nibbling at the edges of the Egyptian Empire by a group of potentially technologically advanced people who are continually hitting the Egyptians in waves. Now, the Egyptians hold them off, but at a cost. You keep fighting wars, eventually you empty your treasury. Simple, basic economics. Now, what happens to the Hittites? Because of the built-in rivalry of the Hittite ruling elite of having to kill each other to stay in power, essentially the Hittites kill themselves off. They break their own rules. And the result is that the Hittite Empire collapses. And what we see is, of course, the pressure from the Assyrians, the vassal states along the western part of the Hittite Empire break away. One of those is Troy. The Trojan War was a real war. It relates to this period. Now, we do have a bit of an issue with the date. Most modern historians like to make it around 1250 BCE. By the way, for those of you not familiar with the term BCE, it's before current era, since we've given up this before Christ business now, officially in the historical world. And if we're talking about AD, we use the term CE, current era. It's not me being politically correct, so for those of you who know me, I'm not, but it's a better way of saying things. So here we have Troy. We see the Trojan War occurring, and the Hittites losing power in that region. We do have the diplomatic archives. If you ever have time, look at the work of Michael Wood and the Trojan War. It's a brilliant documentary made about 20 years ago and addresses some of these great historical issues. And Michael Wood does a far better job than I ever would on the Trojan War, so I do recommend you take a look at it. Here's Troy. Real place. It is Ilium. The ancient name was Wilusa, and as we go through the language to the Homeric Troy, we get Wilusa, Wilus, Ilias, and the hill of Ilium, which is what Heinrich Schliemann dug up and destroyed the archaeology of, because really he was a treasure hunter, not an archaeologist. But he did prove that, for example, when Homer talked of the great walls of Troy, they really are there. And apparently, if we believe the archaeologist, Troy 6 is in fact the Troy of the Homeric epic. And there we have it. Questions? If I haven't bored you all to death yet.
What has been bothering me is the depiction.
We got the Egyptian music playing again.
Is the depiction of the warrior in the chariot. He's not handling the reins of the horses. The horses, therefore, in battle are spooked and they're running wild. He's standing there without anything to hang on, shooting his bow. And why doesn't he just take a tumble headfirst over the edge?
Because he had a driver that used to. There were two men on the chariots.
It just depicted one in this, as you showed there.
Now, was it one of the carvings? Because all the pictures have two men on them, or three. On the carvings, because they're done in relief, you don't see the second man sometimes. But if you look carefully at the individual reliefs, we do actually have depictions of 3 men, 2 men. Generally, the Pharaoh is depicted by himself because he's a god.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the peace treaty. I was curious if it was widely distributed. I know you mentioned a lot of the hieroglyphs that were recorded from the actual battle. I think it's papyrus that was
The papyrus, there are papyrus scrolls that reference it, but the way that the Egyptians used to tell of their glorious victories was, remember, people were illiterate, so they couldn't read, certainly couldn't read papyrus. So it was depicted on the various major monuments, which were the way, and this is why if you looked earlier, I showed you those pictures of Hattusis and the pyramids as they looked at the time. These were huge monuments, and you got to understand, when you came and you saw these things, you were kind of stunned as some guy came from the outback somewhere who didn't live in a city, and most people didn't live in cities. So when you came to the cities, the monuments themselves were your big advertising board. Look how great I am, look what I've done.
A few years ago, I had the chance to visit the British Museum in London and walked up to the Rosetta Stone, which is a massive piece of stone. It's very impressive. And I just wondered what that revealed to us about what we learned from it and what that revealed about battles like this. If you have some comment as far as it would...
Well, without the Rosetta Stone, we would have never been able to translate the hieroglyphs of Egypt. And therefore, we would have never been able to find out what was being said on these buildings. That's why the term a Rosetta Stone has become ubiquitous in the English language as a key to knowledge. And it really became that. It is, and I've seen that myself. London being my hometown, funny enough. So yes, it is one of the most important objects in terms of unraveling the history of that region and time.
I'm curious also about the horses, the breeds and the training, and the fact that, yes, I saw in the images the armor that they had around the sides, but nothing on the legs from what I could see. Why would you not go for the front legs and immediately immobilize the chariots?
In terms of the Hittites, the Hittite heavy chariots had long chain armor that hung low. So, but remember, horses running at speed, armor on its legs can impede it. And you cannot confuse these horses with the heavy war horses of the Middle Ages. Totally different breed, used in a totally different way. And a lot of times, again, the armor that we tend to see on those horses is plate armor, which is jointed. That stuff didn't exist at this period. So you couldn't really put armor on the horse because you couldn't get his joint to move. And yes, certainly attacking a horse and its legs was a way of taking down the horse. But the problem is that, remember, there's people on the chariot attacking you while you're trying to concentrate on this thing coming at you at speed.
The question of what this wasn't a big scam put on by Ramses, like we'll just suck people in and then I'll break it.
No, it wasn't. It's very clear that he made mistakes in the battlefield. And the fact that his army was nowhere close. The other regiments, or divisions, never made it to the battlefield. So if he was planning this big battle, he was outnumbered, 5,000 to 30,000. That's really bad odds. And in an encampment, and this is his own account, he sat in his encampment, he didn't even have his armor on. He was sort of waiting for his army to show up, and the Hittites showed up.
So this was classic victory from the Trojan.
Absolutely, and this was again a sign of his youth as a general.
I'm impressed with how much we know from hieroglyphics that me and the rest of us don't stand and read. I mean, I can read Italian or German a little bit or sort it out. Is this all dependent on what they learned from the Rosetta Stone, which allowed us to break into the cuneiform writing, or were we learning from other sources?
The Rosetta Stone allowed us to get into the hieroglyphics. Cuneiform was the Hittite language, and that was a different sequence of translations at a different time frame. It was actually Napoleon's expedition to Egypt that discovered the Rosetta Stone, and then, I forget the chronology on this because I'm not an Egyptologist, but it took about, 20 or 30 years, and there's a documentary that was recently made about this, which allowed people to break apart the hieroglyphs because we had the ancient Greek, I think it was Akkadian, and then the hieroglyphs all on the Rosetta Stone.
Sunil, do we know what caused the decline and obsolescence of the chariot as a main force weapon?
What we see is an advance in archery, and also we start seeing, for example, the ideas of the phalanx, which the Macedonians perfected under Alexander, but certainly, we've all seen the Spartans. Essentially, the chariot was a great weapon as long as you didn't have great big lines of pointy sticks blocking you, i.e. the phalanx and large spears, and large-scale archery. This kind of goes back to Anne's question about the horses. Horses were vulnerable to archery fire. So again, the horses of that period aren't particularly large animals. How much armor can you put on them before they become too slow? And the reason the Egyptian chariots are so critical is the Egyptians made their chariots super light. That's what made them fast and agile. Because the more armor you put on, the slower that vehicle becomes. It becomes a tank. You can take a lot of hits, but even a tank eventually can lose a track or can be disabled mechanically.
Are there any more questions? I guess we've got time for one more if anybody has a question.
This isn't really relevant to your representation, but is there any evidence of the Hebrews being in Egypt at this time?
We actually discussed it a little earlier, and I'll very briefly address this. Certainly they were there. They were not slaves. That is a biblical myth, because if 100,000 Hebrews were driven out of Egypt, the Egyptian economy would have collapsed the next morning. It's an issue of numbers. I think realistically it was probably around, if we're talking about Exodus, for example, which is not part of this story, though it has been linked to this period, there certainly were. I don't know if they fought in the ranks of any of these armies, but they certainly were in the region.
On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening to us today. Watch for announcements of future event transcripts, and we hope that you will be able to join us in person for our regular speakers events. Once again, thank you for tuning into our podcasts, and have a wonderful day.